إن الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله أما بعد.
So, Bismillahirrahmanirrahim, Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen, wassalatu wassalamu ala Rasul Kareem. Alhamdulillah, inshallah, we will presume with the written legacy of the Imam Muwaffaq Ibn Qudamah. And Shaykh, could you then please systematically take us through the written legacy of the Imam?
Okay, so Alhamdulillah, we're still looking at volume 4 of the Tabaqat of Ibn Rajab Al-Hanbali rahimahullah, which he's built from his gathering of the data from Hijaz and Mauritania, as well as Imam Al-Dhahabi, as well as Abu Umar Al-Maqdisi, and other sources that he's gathered together, as well as the students of the Imam like Shamsuddin Ibn Qudamah, and all subsequent biographies like An-Na'at Al-Akmal or Sahab al-Wabil and others are built upon Ibn Rajab's research. So he starts by saying, ذِكْرُ تَصَانِيفِهِ. Let us make mention of his written legacy. صنف الشيخ الموفق رحمه الله تصانيف الكثيرة الحسنات في المذهب فروع وأصولا. The Shaykh Muwaffaq al-Din Qudamah rahimahullah authored many good books in the madhhab in both branch issues and foundational matters. وفي الحديث واللغة والزهد والرقائق, in hadith, in Arabic language, on the topic of zuhud, and heart-softening matters that had to do with narratives from the early generations. وتصانيفه في أصول الدين في غاية الحسن, and his authored works in usul al-din are the highest level of goodness. أكثرها على طريقة أئمة المحدثين. Most of it follows on the pathway of the Imams of Hadith. مشحونة بالأحاديث والآثار, and it is built upon with ample sources of ahadith and narratives of the early generations. وبالأسانيد, and with chains of transmission. كما هي طريقة الإمام أحمد وأئمة الحديث, just as was the way of the Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal and the Imams of Hadith. ولم يكن يرى الخوض مع المتكلمين في دقائق الكلام, and he did not believe in disputation with the people of speculative theology in the detailed matters on using speculative theology in those affairs. ولو كان بالرد عليهم, even if it was to refute innovators or other people. This was not his way. وهذه طريقة أحمد والمتقدمين, and this is the way of Ahmad ibn Hanbal radiallahu anhu and the predecessors that came before Muwaffaq ibn Qudamah. وكان كثير متابعا للمنقول في باب الأصول وغيره, and he was regularly following the pathway of the naql that had been handed down on the subject of usul al-din and others. لا يرى إطلاق ما لم يؤثر من العبارات, and he did not believe in excessive discussion on matters that bore no benefit or very slickly worded speeches and the like. ويأمر بالإقرار والإمرار لما جاء في الكتاب والسنة من الصفات, and he commanded people to affirm, pass by the text just as they came from the book and the sunnah on the topic of the attributes, من غير تفسير, without explanation or giving meaning to, ولا تكييف, without giving how, ولا تمثيل, without giving likeness, ولا تحريف, without corruption, ولا تأويل, without interpretation, ولا تعطيل, and without stripping the attributes of their existence and qualities. فمن تصانيفه في أصول الدين, with regard to his authored works in usul al-din, Al-Burhan fi mas'alat al-Quran, we have the book Al-Burhan fi mas'alat al-Quran, juz'un wahid, this was one part by itself. جواب مسألة وردت من صرخة في القرآن. Then we also have the narrated matter regarding the detailed discussion of the Quran. Now this is to do with the nazam. What the Imam is referring to here is these two texts are dealing with the nazam, the actual composition of the Quran. So the actual skeletal text, the actual khat, that is indeed the Quran, the speech of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that is in indeed the preserved tablet. So we're not talking about the harakat, we're not talking about the nuqat. We're talking about that text is indeed that which is in the preserved tablet. And he went into great detail in discussing why that's the case and was very harsh against those who deemed otherwise. جزء الاعتقاد يعني لمة الاعتقاد. And then he has another one was الاعتقاد لمة الاعتقاد. جزء مسألة العلو. He has another text entitled The Issue of Allah's Loftiness or Highness. Juz'an, and this is in 2 parts. Another one, ذم التأويل, which is the dispraised affair and censure of interpreting. جزء واحد, and this is in 1 part. Kitab al-Qadr, then there's a discussion on Qadr, Juz'an, which is in 2 parts. And this book on Qadr, it just deals with the topic of Qadr, so it's just ayat and ahadith, that's it. There's hardly any commentary from the Imam himself. Fada'il al-Sahaba, another book is The Virtues of the Companions, Juz'an, which is in 2 parts. وأظنه منهاج القاصدين في فضل الخلفاء الراشدين. There's another book entitled The Way of Those Wayfaring on the Path in discussing the virtue of the rightly guided Khalifas. رسالة للشيخ فخر الدين ابن تيمية في تخليد أهل البدع في النار. There's another book which he wrote as a message to the Shaykh Fakhruddin ibn Taymiyyah, who died 622 Hijri, regarding declaring the people of innovation to be in the fire for all eternity. Now, this was because the Imam who wrote Al-Bulgha and other kutub that are mu'tamid from the mutaqaddimin and mutawassitin, Imam Fakhruddin, who's a cousin of Taqi ibn Taymiyyah, this big Imam, what he wrote about the people of innovation seemed as if he was condemning all innovators to the fire forever. Right. So Muwaffaq Ibn Qudamah, the Imam rahimahullah, wrote a letter to him asking him a clarification on this. And the letter that came back, indeed, alhamdulillah, was clarification that his statements were general, but were being misunderstood by some to mean each and every and all innovators in the fire forever. But that's not the case. Right. So that was about a few pages risala that he sent him. Then you have مسألة في تحريم النظر في كتب أهل الكلام, a book regarding the issue of the prohibition of looking into the books of the people of speculative theology. So this is his theological legacy regarding what he wrote on the topic. So he wrote a series of books to do with theological matters that are very salient. And in one way, shape, or another, they're studied either themselves or some derivative of them. So if you look at the Lum'ah, for example, the Lum'ah is the taking of all of Imam Ahmad's 12 books on theology, boiling them down into a rhyming text, which is Lum'at al-I'tiqad, which is 8 fusul, 8 units, 86 paragraphs. And for each issue in I'tiqad, each aqad, there is a ayah and or hadith or discussion from the early generations on that topic to establish it. Then you had people that came after, which were Ibn Hamdan. His Nihaya is pretty much a sharh on the Lum'ah, where you can tell he was citing the Lum'ah. Then you have, he died 695 Hijri. Then you have Imam Ibn Qa'id al-Najdi, who wrote Najat al-Khalaf fi i'tiqad al-Salaf, which is pretty much a mukhtasar of the Lum'ah. Well, by the time you come to Imam al-Safarini, he had gathered together the Lum'ah and all the other texts, like, for example, the Mukhtasar of Imam al-Albani in I'tiqad, as well as Ain al-Athar, others. He'd gathered them all together, boiled them down, wrote a rhyming text, and then did a sharh on his own rhyming text. Right. So this is the highest expansion of the Lum'ah. So the Lum'ah, in one way, shape, or another, has gone down through history and has been used quite frequently, right, for the past 8 centuries.
And I wanted to ask you, these theological works that you just mentioned, are they supposed to be studied in a particular order?
Well, usually what happens is someone is taught the Lum'ah first, because the Lum'ah covers all affairs of the usul ad-din, and then also unfolds into the i'tiqad and each aqad. Then when you talk about them at Ta'wil and others, those are specific uqud, those are specific doctrines. So the issue of Mas'alatul Ulu is an aqad, it's a specific doctrine. Right. Then when you look at them at Ta'wil, that's a specific doctrine. Right. That's so that's in addition to the Lum'ah, you can branch off and study deeply into those affairs on a more systematic basis to just look at that issue. The issue with the Quran, he has another one, al-Harf al-Qadim, al-Harf al-Qadim, as-Sirat al-Mustaqim, bi-Ithbat al-Harf al-Qadim. This book is about the Quran being the eternal speech of Allah and establishing the proofs for that. Right, that those kutub are separate uqud, they're separate doctrines that you can study in more detail, because those are some of the more standout doctrines between the first three generations and those of the Khalaf. Whereas the Lum'ah deals with not only the issues between the Salaf and the Khalaf, but also the cults as well. But specifically, those books on the uqud, they deal with some of the disputes within Ahlul Sunnah, particularly between the Salaf and the Khalaf. And so he expertly joins between those. And subsequent books were built on top of his books, or they summarized them and then read those books together in that way, shape, or form. So Imam Safarini uses and cites that literature in his Lawami' and also his Lawa'ih. So there's no way to get around that.
And an interesting point is that Imam Ibn Qudamah, since he has gathered the Lum'atul I'tiqad, since that period of time, he basically compiled the creed of the first three generations, and people have been basically studying that text since that age.
Yes, this issue has been, by him gathering together all of these affairs in the capacity that he's done so, it's pretty much made people able to study it in a condensed fashion. Right. And because the text, the way it's taught, where it rhymes, you have 86 paragraphs, you have your 8 units, and people are able to study it, memorize it, read it, and then study the commentary literature and the mukhtasarat on it and build their knowledge from there. And subsequent books were written, but in some way, shape, or form, it's either mukhtasar or sharh on it, or it was inspired by the Lum'ah or subsequent kutub. Like Balbani is pretty much a mukhtasar in some way, shape, or form of that. When you actually examine Balbani, you can see that he's kind of lifted it. It was inspired. And Najat al-Khalaf is openly, you can tell it's a mukhtasar of the Lum'ah. It's very easy to see that for someone that studies the text.
So outside of being a Shaykh al-Madhhab, he is basically also the primary reference for the i'tiqad of the Salaf.
Yes, he's gathered together all of these books in a systematic fashion, right? And even on the topic of Qadr, where he has that book, so people looking to study the issue of Qada and Qadr, just that issue systematically, right? They can study that. So you have the Lum'ah, which you would study first, and then individual uqud, individual doctrines, especially if they're very prickly in your area, those books are useful. So when we did them with Ta'wil, it was very important in understanding, because at the time, the issue of discussing the meanings of Allah's names and attributes became a real big issue, especially at the time. You know, you're in London, in the US, it was there as well. So this issue came up again and again. It was in Canada. Mexico, it wasn't. The believers in Mexico somehow protected, the Mexican Muslims have somehow protected themselves from the bid'ah. But in the United States and Canada and the UK, especially England and Ireland, it's been really forcefully and aggressively the case that this has been done. So we went from people going to the degree of likening Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was creation, and now we're in an era where there's people who are almost denying Allah's names and attributes under the guise of saying this is the true creed of the Sunnis, which is it's gone to the other end of the spectrum, unfortunately now.
So I just wanted to ask this so that people don't misunderstand the correct history. Since the Imam wrote books refuting Ilm al-Kalam and Ta'wil, it does not mean that he negated the Ash'ari to be outside of Ahl Sunnah.
No, this is not the case, because we have to remember, at the historical epoch of time that the Imam lived in, he was in the army of Salahuddin Ayyubi. And it's very important to understand that although they differed on these areas, they did see each other as Ahlul Sunnah, because if someone's definitely an innovator, like in the case of the Khawarij, you can't be under their army or you can't be under their authority, because those are people of Bu'at, those are people of wrongdoing, and it's impermissible to do that. So the fact that he was in that army, the fact that they legitimized each other's authority, is indicative of the fact of what's happened. Now, that does not take away from some of the things that happened, because as when the Ash'aris formed as a crystallized Jama'ah in the time of Al-Qadi Abu Ya'la, rahimahullah, who died 458, then they start to spread out. So when you get to the 500s, they reach North Africa, and they're also now in Damascus. And as they start to gain power, they try to emphasize their power base. So they told people that you need to be upon the i'tiqad of the Khalaf. And it caused problems because Muwaffaq Ibn Qudamah and Abdul Ghani ibn Abdul Wahid al-Maqdisi were faced with issues, to the point that Abdul Ghani ibn Abdul Wahid al-Maqdisi, they destroyed his minbar. They took axes and chopped down his minbar in Ajami Bani Umayyah. He had to escape to Egypt for protection. And once that happened, the Banu Qudamah, they all just grabbed their swords and their arrows, and they said, if they come to Jami Mudaffari, we'll just cut everyone down. And so it had to be, because you have to remember, as they're spreading, they also used statecraft, because they were looking to be strengthened by the state, by the government, and other things like this. So these are historical epics, but in spite of even these more ugly scenes, which can all be seen in tabaqat literature, whether they're written by Hanbalis or even by Imam al-Zahabi himself. These are all things that can easily be done. If someone goes to Siyar A'lam al-Nubala, it can be seen that this was the case, and that they would tell people that they had to follow this when the laity, as well as imams like Muwaffaq ibn Qudamah, were insistent and said, no, we don't.
So they were insisting that the people should follow the creed of the Khalaf, which would entail that they would make use of kalam and ta'wil.
Yes, and which they were insistent, because you must remember the ditty that they gave in the time of Fakhruddin al-Bazdawi, which is Tariq al-Salaf Aslam. The way of the Salaf is safer. Wa Tariq al-Khalaf Ahkam wa A'lam. But the way of the Khalaf is wiser and more knowledgeable. Now, no one who follows the first three generations is going to agree with that. No one's going to agree with that. Right, which is also indicative of the fact that they said that is acknowledgement of the fact that they know that the i'tiqad is the Khalaf. They know it's not the Salaf. Right. So this has been the situation. But now we find today some people saying that i'tiqad is the i'tiqad of the Salaf, which is actually a lie and running contrary to the very Ash'ari who had said, like Imam Nawawi, who said this, the i'tiqad of the Khalaf. He said himself in his 40 hadith that Tariq al-Salaf Aslam, Khalaf Ahkam. So he repeated that same ditty. And it was also repeated by Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani, who died 952, and it was repeated by Imam Nawawi, who died 676, because it was first uttered by Imam Fakhruddin al-Bazdawi, the big Maturidi. It was uttered by him in the 500s.
They basically confirm that there is a distinction between the two.
Yes, and they acknowledge that. Now, that's been understood and known. But now we've come into this time where people are now telling us that these two Jama'ahs are the Salaf. They themselves said at the time of their appearance that we're not. And then in addition to that, as they began to gain strength in numbers, they tried to force other people to follow this way of thinking. So what were the people that they were forcing? Now you have to ask those questions now. What were the Malikis in North Africa? What was North Africa? What was and is Sham? What was and is Iraq? What was and is Arabia? Why were the Hanafis kicked out of the Hijaz? Why was their mihrab empty for several hundred years? Why? Why did they never acknowledge the Ottomans? You have to ask these type of questions. And we have a right to ask these questions to put things in perspective. But when you try to ask these questions using these historical pieces of data in the books, you start hearing these howls of pain. and these squeals. And unfortunately, in order to clean a wound, you have to allow those squeals of pain and howls, and to clean the wound out, to pour the hydrogen peroxide on it so that it can bubble up. Then you wrap the wound and dress it, and then it can heal. Because what's happening in the English-speaking world is this really weird, funky thing where people are being made to choose up sides, but people are taking stances that they know nothing about, espousing theological positions they don't know, making takfir, tajseem, and tabdir on imams they know nothing about, regarding books they've never read, with sheikhs they've never studied, with a madhhab and an entire theological discipline that they've never known in their lives. That's how serious this is. That's how serious it is.
Sheikh, there are today, unfortunately, some individuals that declare the Shaykh al-Islam to be a mujassim. Now, does this come down to them having bad naql of his books?
Well, it's going to come down to two issues. It's not just bad naql, it's also bad teachers, because much of what you're finding today in this current time in the English-speaking world, the great bulk of the people claiming Ash'ari they're imposters. The great bulk of them they're leaning on two main people for their i'tiqad, both of whom are liars. Not only on Muwaffaq Ibn Qudamah and others, but they also lie regarding their own i'tiqad. I mean, when you have one of them now become Mu'tazila during the time in the late 90s of the Kafir calendar with Saqaf, because that's the end result of the ilm al-kalam and the takfir and all those other things. And now there's going to be another one who's headed in that same direction. And it's only the natural outgrowth of what happens when you live by takfir and tajseem and tabdir, right? Where you have people openly saying such and such, the kafir or the murtad, like openly attaching these things to the names. Those are things that for us disqualify us to make salah behind you. Not because you're definitely a kafir, but because of not only the naql, but takfir without right, improper application of the rules of takfir and hukm murtad, you're just disqualified from making salah behind. You know, and people don't understand when they use words like tajseem and tashbih. They're words that they use like ketchup and mayo. If they really understood what this entails and what happened, the fact that Jahm ibn Safwan, who did have tajseem, was actually killed as a preventative measure and buried. Ja'd ibn Dirham was killed as a preventative measure and buried. So when you understand what that means, why weren't the people that you accuse why weren't they killed? Precisely because they were not.
Right.
Precisely because they were not. And then when you start doing what I would call the theological anthropology, if we go back to a time before your Jama'ahs existed, when we go to that time period and we're told that the Ummah will never unite upon error, then before you existed, the Ummah wasn't upon error. When you came to exist, the Ummah was not upon error. And if you fade away, the Ummah will still not be upon error. We have to keep it very simple.
Right.
Because the laity don't have that level of sophistication and 77 different ta'wilat on one ayah. They don't know anything about ni'matain and qudratain. They just don't. You can explain it to them 100 times and they don't. It's just the fact of the matter. So this methodology and following what Imam Ibn Qudamah rahimahullah followed, he mentions that he followed Imam Ahmad rahimahullah and also the mutaqaddimin, which means the previous people before him, because the Hanbali scholars or scholars that were from that same theological tradition of the first few generations, they tended to write books in a series.
MashaAllah.
So they'd write a series of books and they would write them in order. Now, sometimes they would date the book, or they would write the book in the fashion where you could tell what order they were in and the reason behind why it was written. So you could follow their tradition. So you look at Lalaka'i. Lalaka'i is another example of someone upon the i'tiqad of the Salaf. His Sharh Usul i'tiqad Ahl Sunnah, that book is written very deliberately. And he has other couple of kutub that are shorter and slimmer. And you can tell by the introduction that it was written precisely for no other purpose but to be read in that order when someone reads it. So that method of the early generations in writing books in, I guess, series, or writing a large book and laying it out, dating it, or saying what the book is to be used for, that's an amal that goes back quite a few centuries that is traceable. And you can see the purpose for it. Right. Now, looking at what Ibn Rajab goes on to say, ومن تصانيفه في الحديث مختصر العلل للخلال مجلد ضخم مشيخة شيوخه جزء وأجزاء كثيرة خرجها. And from his authored works in hadith, you have مختصر العلل, which is a text of a mukhtasar of ahadith on the affairs of hadith that may have flaws or subtleties in them that require clarification, by Abu Bakr al-Khalal, who died 311 Hijri, who was one of the students of Imam Ahmad, which is a thick volume. And then you have a listing of Imam Ibn Qudamah, rahimahullah, his sheikhs in hadith. And he transmits regularly from Ibn al-Jawzi. That's one of his sheikhs in hadith. Abdul Qadir Al-Jilani, rahimahullah, is another one, along with Al-Hakari and others. ومن تصانيفه في الفقه, and from his authored works in fiqh we have Al-Mughni في الفقه 10 مجلدات, Al-Mughni شرح مختصر الخرقي. This is his book in fiqh, his largest one, which is 10 volumes. Al-Kafi في الفقه, Al-Kafi in fiqh 4 مجلدات, which is 4 volumes. Al-Muqni' في الفقه, Al-Muqni' مجلد واحد, which is 1 single large volume. مختصر الهداية, the summary of Al-Hidayah by Mahfuz al-Kalwadani, who died 510, مجلد واحد, which is 1 large volume. Al-Umdah في الفقه مجلد صغير, which is a small work. مناسك الحج, carrying out the rites of Hajj, جزء واحد, which is a small text. ذم الوسواس, the censure against whisperings that come into the self, which is 1 slim volume. وفتاوى مسائل منثورة والرسائل الشتى كثيرة. And he has also a book of fatawa and masail that is well-rounded, as well as other beneficial researches on the topic of fiqh. Now, when discussing his fiqh history, we have to look at what we know as his tartib al-kutub, which are the order that he wrote his books in, which is Al-Mughni, then the Umdah, then the Muqni', then the Kafi. But that is the order that he wrote them in. But that's not the order of authority. So his final statement on fiqh is Al-Kafi. So if you're looking to decisively quote Muwaffaq al-Qudamah rahimahullah, you do not quote Al-Mughni. If you're looking to quote the Mu'tamad of the madhhab using Muwaffaq al-Qudamah's works, you quote Al-Kafi. At the beginning of each book, he actually states what the purpose is for that book and how to use it. So in the beginning of Al-Umdah fil Fiqh, he says that I wrote this Umdatan liqari'ihi as a supporting pillar for the reader that will make it easy for him to memorize and follow through with it. So that's the purpose why it was written for the beginner. At the beginning of Al-Muqni', he says, I've written this for mid-level mutawassitin, mid-level readers for memorization and understanding. Then you get to the Kafi. He said, I've written this for senior readers who were advanced in their understanding. Now, let's look at the composition of those books. First, the Umdah, as we discussed before, is composed of ahadith as well as the fiqh ruling. So for each fiqh mas'ala, there is an ayah and or hadith and some ilal, some cause behind why it's the case, which makes it such a strong book. To the degree that the Imam Abdul Qadir Al-Jilani, rahimahullah, he said that students of knowledge should use that for their ahkam, for studying. So they should study Umdat al-Ahkam and use that like a sharh on Umdat al-Ahkam. They should use that for their ahkam. And two of my teachers who were Shafi'i, they tended to use it for Ahkam as well, because it was so well-rounded of a kitab, especially the sharh that's written on it by Bahauddin Al-Maqdisi rahimahullah, who died 624 Hijri. That sharh is the best sharh on the Umdah. Right? It's the most authoritative because that's his first cousin. He can ask him what he meant by those terms, the layout of those terms, and then also further breaking down the text. It's a fantastic work, Al-Uddah Sharh Al-Umdah. Right. So I use that, you use that for building and understanding Ahkam and things. For the now that's actually filled with the evidences. When you get to the Mughni does not have most of the evidences. Because now what you're supposed to be doing, studying the Mughni, is you're supposed to be thinking now, using the understanding that you've taken away, working out the masail. That's what you're supposed to be doing. So sometimes in a statement you'll have وَالْحُكْمُ عَلَيْهِ, and the ruling on it, wajhan, is two possible rulings. Now you have to now go back to Al-Umdah or other and to work out what the mu'tamad is. That's what it's used for. That's the purpose behind it. And so the Mughni is this thick fist size volume. Then when you get to Al-Kafi, all the evidences and proofs with the ilal, with the mu'tamad, they've been put back in now. So now you're combining all that knowledge together and grasping and understanding and everything else. Now, authorities then took Al-Mughni, like Musa Al-Hajjawi, he boiled it down to Zad al-Mustaqni', and he said in the introduction, Ala qawlan wahid, fi madhhabi Ahmad, I organized the text so that it was only upon one qawl, which is the mu'tamid, the preferred position in the school. So he removed all the where it says wajhan, or sometimes he give you, like in the Mughni, the original Mughni, he give you like 4 statements.
Wow.
Like there are 4 statements on this matter. By
Imam Ahmad.
Yes, right. So you had to work that out and understand that. Well, Imam Musa Al-Hajjawi rahimahullah, he takes that away in Zad al-Mustaqni' bi-ikhtisar al-Mughni' by boiling it down, making it into something that's rhyming as well, and then also making it upon one qawl, which is the mu'tamad, right? And then Al-Kafi covers that. And then Al-Mughni is this comparative digest, which he says at the beginning is his purpose for doing so, as he says in the introduction, tabarrukan. He did this as an act of barakah. He did it as an act of barakah, right? So by doing so as an act of barakah, to show the rank of these other schools, but also to show the rajih, the preferredness, rank, and preference of the school of Imam Ahmad. That's what it says in the beginning.
And the ahkam of the Hanbali madhhab within Al-Mughni, do they also have different opinions, or is it mu'tamad? Or?
Well, the point of Al-Mughni is a comparative digest. It's not necessarily to establish the mu'tamad.
Okay.
Right? It's to compare between, right? To say, so you're comparing the usul and the ilal between the Hanbalis and the other schools.
Okay.
And within that, sometimes he'll quote like several rulings, like he'll say, now with regard to this ruling, Khiraqi, Ibn Battah, and Abu Bakr Abdul Aziz say this. And then he'll say, walana, but then there's another group which we belong to, we say this. Right? So he'll have that methodology, and he'll do that on purpose to show the variations of opinion and discussion on the topic. So that's the point of what Al-Mughni is used for, is comparative study. But you wouldn't use the Mughni to establish the mu'tamad of the Hanbali madhhab or the mu'tamad of other schools.
Right, okay.
Which in the introduction, the author has made it clear that it's used, this is a barakah effort to show the ahkam and rulings and all the other things, the evidences in the text. I mean, if you took Al-Mughni, you could put the whole Quran back together, because all of the ayat are quoted in there pretty much. I'd say you're probably maybe 50 short. And then there's like thousands of ahadith. And now with that, you have the Mughni. Now, Imam Shamsuddin Qudamah, who's his nephew, writes Ash-Shafi, Sharh al-Mughni, also known as Ash-Sharh al-Kabir, which is a commentary on the Mughni. So he sat with his uncle and learned the Mughni and mastered it. And he dies in 682 Hijri. So subsequent scholars that wrote commentaries on the Mughni include Burhanuddin ibn Muflih, who died 885, the Furu' of Imam Shamsuddin ibn Muflih, who died 762, is pretty much, it follows along the same pathway as that. So you have that. Then you have Imam al-Zarkashi, who follows, although he's using the Mukhtasar of al-Khiraqi, he's one of the 400 commentators on al-Khiraqi. You can tell he's also following the Mughni. Then you have Imam Alauddin al-Mardawi, who writes a sharh on the Mughni, which is Al-Insaf, which is 21 volumes, right? So you have these people that are doing this immense amount of juhud on, so you had 400 commentaries on Mukhtasar al-Khiraqi, but the most famous becomes Al-Mughni. Then you have Al-Mughni and all these commentators working out Al-Mughni up to the age of Al-Uskari and others. And then Imam Al-Hajjawi rahimahullah boils down the text. Then Imam Al-Buhuti rahimahullah built it back up. So he takes all the knowledge, all the shuruh on the Mughni, and creates Ar-Rawd al-Murbi'. Right. So that's what's done with his Mughni text. That's the influence that text has. Now, on the back of that, saying that, the Umdah fil Fiqh has also had massive influence because of that sharh, to the point that a Mauritanian Sheikh, Sheikh Adoud, has boiled down the Mughni text into a rhyming text, an even smaller rhyming text, called the Withaqa or something like that, if memory serves me correct. So even the Mauritanians have made use of the text because the Ahkam that are in it, the Ahadith, the Ilal, like the reasoning of the text, it's brilliant. It's an absolutely brilliant text. And the metin, the main transmittable metin that they're following is what's transmitted through Imam Muwaffaq, through his cousin, which was partially raised by Abu Umar al-Maqdisi. He was partially raised by him. Because when Bahauddin al-Maqdisi rahimahullah's father died, Abu Umar al-Maqdisi took him on, and he became almost like his father. So they spent a lot of time together being first cousins. And so that text is transmitted through him, and it's the preferred metin given by Imam Ismail ibn Badran, because it was read to him. Because at the time that when that text was print, it's been read to him countless times, and the preferred narrative is the one that was read to him when they were actually sitting at the mimbar in Jami Mudaffir, and it was read to him, and he says, "Yes, this is good." So it's very, very well known. It's the only one I've ever used, and then the Al-Uddah Sharh Al-Umdah, the only one I've used has been the Qatari, the Qatari manuscript. But it's a fantastic text. And he's literally laid out this curriculum. Then he did a Mukhtasar of Al-Hidayah by Imam Mahfuz Al-Kalwadhani, in which, by making a Mukhtasar, he put Al-Kalwadhani's Hidayah on one qawl, because Imam Al-Kalwadhani would have several qawls inside. But he put it on one qawl and said, okay, it's this. Right. So he did an immense amount of work. Then he did a commentary on the unique words of Al-Khiraqi that's in his Mukhtasar. So he actually did a Mukhtasar of the Mukhtasar of Al-Khiraqi. So he did an immense, he's got about 6 books in Fiqh, Imam Ibn Qudamah rahimahullah. He did an immense work.
Does he then at this point become the Mu'tamad?
Well, him and Majduddin Taymiyyah are the Mu'tamad. They are the Mu'tamad by gathering their books together, because they're the 2 great collectors of that period. And so when scholars gather together their books of these 2 big collectors, they were more encompassing. They were osa. They were more vast and encompassing in their ijtihad and knowledge of anyone else in their time. And so because of that, muraja of their time and subsequent made those books the mainstay. And then subsequent books were the basis of that, until you reach the era of the 2 big collectors, the Osa, the most vast collectors of their time, which in that case were Musa al-Hajjawi and Taqiyuddin al-Futuhi. right? And then that the same process happened there, and then you get to Al-Buhuti and Al-Karmi, and then the same thing happens there, and then you get to Al-Ruhaybani and Al-Shati, right? And that process happens there, and so forth, right? So now what's happened is the two kutub that are actually shuruh but have become mutun. So Ar-Rawd al-Murbi' is pretty much a metin now, how it's treated. And then the Imam al-Taghlibi's sharh on Dalil al-Talib is pretty much a metin, it's treated as a metin now. And the interesting thing about that is Manar al-Sabil by Imam Ibn Dawayan, which is actually it's supposed to be a sharh on Dalil al-Talib, but he built most of his masail from it on the Mukhtasar of Khiraqi. So it's also like a sharh on Zad al-Mustaqni'. It's like a sharh or a hashi on that. So you'll find that there'll be people like a lot of the Gulf Hanabila will study Manar al-Sabil, but they won't read the Dalil. They'll study Manar al-Sabil while they're reading Zad al-Mustaqni'. Because the Dalil is not the big text in the Gulf, it's the Zad.
It would be used as a reference alongside the Zad.
Yes, like an Ahkam piece of literature, because the ahadith in there, the way he cites ahadith and works things out, gives you a great reference. It's a fantastic reference work, Ibn Dawayan. It's a wonderful work in terms of working out the supporting texts, and then every now and then he'll say, now another opinion exists where Taqi ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah has said this, although the sahih is this, right? So he'll give you a little bit of like some ikhtilaf in the schools sometimes, or he'll give you two possibilities. He'll say, now there's two possibilities. You could do this or this, but the mu'tamid is this. So he gives you, so in case an incident comes where you can't do the mu'tamid, you can defer to the other one. So it's really, so Ibn Dawayan has done a fantastic job. And the government, because he died 1353, rahimahullah, the government tried to get him in his history book as well as his fiqh book to praise the Ala Saud from the government, and he refused to. And what happened is they put him on house arrest. But he's a fantastic scholar, Ibn Dawayan. He's a big towering figure. He's one of the most important commentators on the Dalil as well as the Mukhtasar al-Khiraqi. So when I heard someone speak ill of him recently, that's supposed to be knowledgeable and say that Manar al-Sabil is like lacking in benefit or verse, okay, it's like I have to avoid this person, because it's like that is unacceptable. You know, it's not knowing your rank. When you don't know your rank, like here's what he said at the end of Manar al-Sabil. He said, "This is the utmost of my effort." Now listen to this. It's a statement of humility, but it's also kind of like a challenge. He said, "This is my statement on the matter, and the best of my effort that I could expel, although I'm indigent. If someone should find a better way or be more knowledgeable, let him pick up the text and build on top of it and do better." But that's 1353. Nothing's happened since then. Nothing's happened since then. But you had someone in this time say that, yeah, that's not really that beneficial, it's a joke or whatever, and use this type of language about Ibn Dawayan when they don't understand what they're studying, right? If you understood who these people were, you would kiss these books and put them on your forehead and not have this attitude towards them if you really understood who these people were. But it's one of the things that sometimes acquisition of any type of knowledge blinds people to real knowledge. That's the sick part about it. So when you look at the legacy of Imam Ibn Qudamah rahimahullah in fiqh, it's just reverberated all the way down. You know, it's permeated the madhhab for the past 900 years in some way, shape, or form. Right? Because his fahm was just so strong. And when you read his books, his understanding is so strong in terms of like grasping the text, understanding its application, you know, and the different aspects of a given mas'ala. It's just so strong, his understanding and his ability to take what are seemingly complex issues and to make them digestible to the student. You see the wisdom why he sat down and wrote a 4-book curriculum. He actually sat down and wrote a curriculum, then went to the works of the Mutaqaddimin and like simplified the Hidayah of Al-Kalwadani. He actually simplified the Hidayah. And then also simplified Khiraqi. Like he did an absolutely stellar work, a really stellar work for subsequent scholars and students.
I was just wondering about one thing. You mentioned that some scholars, they took his Muqni' and they made other mukhtasars out of it. But why did they go for the Muqni' and not Al-Kafi?
Well, Al-Kafi, when you look at Majduddin ibn Taymiyyah, he was kind of inspired by the Muqni' and Al-Kafi to create Al-Muharrar fil Fiqh. And so what happened is the scholars of the Najd took Al-Kafi, of Najd and Iraq, they took Al-Kafi and they began the process of breaking it down and boiling it down. So you had Imam Dujaili, who died 732. His kitab, Al-Wajiz, you can see that he's kind of built a lot from the Kafi. And you can see that Al-Hajjawi built from Al-Kafi and a lot of other things. Like you can see that he's used the Wajiz in creating Zad al-Mustaqni'. That being said, that's part of the reason why the scholars took the Muqni' rather than the Kafi, because the Muqni' had so many other qualities in it, because the Kafi was a finishing school book. It's your finishing school. But the Muqni' was your mid-level or advanced student text, or semi-advanced, intermediate to advanced. And they wanted to take that text and simplify it. And so by taking that text and deciding to simplify it, they built all these other commentaries and summaries on top of that text. And the reasoning for it was the ambiguity in the text, which needed to be worked out. And then also the hidden gems that are in that text that they decided to use, because the Kafi is very obvious. It's a really obvious text. It's 4 volumes. Now, when you talk about disseminating that text to a wider audience, how do you disseminate 4 volumes to a wider audience? Right. Then you have to remember, if you were going to use the Umdah to disseminate to a wider audience, because you have to remember, knowledge is decreasing.
Right.
How well will an audience be able to grasp, a wider audience be able to grasp all the ilal and everything else that is in the Umdah or the Uddah? Okay, let's take the Muqni' and boil it down and make this or some form of it into a metin that can be used by everybody, from the simplest layman all the way up. And that was the goal.
Wow.
Right, that was pretty much the goal. And you have the smallest of the kutub, which is Akhsar Mukhtasarat, which you can tell was partially inspired by the Muqni', by Imam Balbani rahimahullah, that 1083. You can tell like there was some inspiration in that book that, you can tell he pulled from the Muqni' and the Zad, because both of them had been written by that time.
And since that Al-Muqni' has more than one opinion, would they at the same time consult Al-Kafi, or would they also do that and make ijtihad as well with the other opinion from Ahmed?
Well, no. When you cite literature like that, you have 3 types of things. One is you have what is the mu'tamad and what's agreed. Number 2, you have cases that are still open. And those cases weren't resolved yet because the question that was asked, the real life events that would necessitate the answer to that question haven't happened yet. Then the third thing is when you have a council issue that's still open, where there was a council meeting, because they would come together and have these council meetings. So you have a council meeting where you agreed to discuss some other issues and not others, because the issues you were discussing, the primary issues, the predominant issues, took more precedence over the other issues. So the less pressing issues were dealt with later down the line. Right. So when you're reading these books, because that's why someone's saying, well, if all this has been answered, then why are you having shuruh and mukhtasarat in every era? Well, it's precisely because not all of it is answered. Because some issues had to be left because, okay, this is a question that was asked, but the reality of it hasn't happened yet. But it was just asked. Like, okay, well, what happens when we do this? Well, we don't know. We won't know until that happens. And then there's another issue where it's been left open and it's not been resolved. So some issues, like there's some points where Imam Abdul Ghani Al-Lubidi, he closed like some masail and his hashia underneath the, like he closed like some open issues. He closed like 10 issues. He's like, okay, this issue has not been answered before. And based upon the fact that it's not been answered before, I've taken it upon myself to answer. Allah forgive me for any mistake I might make. This is the answer to this question. So he resolved it. I'll give you an example. One issue that was open was the fact of when someone has a tattoo, whether they have wudu or not. Because when you get a tattoo, including now, the blood rises to the surface and it scabs over. Now, that blood rising to the surface and scabbing over, that blood doesn't go away. So there's that najasa on the surface of the epidermal layer. So that level of blood that's there could be alive. If it's an arm tattoo or it's blood, it's like you're bleeding all the time.
Right.
Which is something that makes wudu impossible to hold because the najasa is flowing. So there were a body of Hanbalis, a big body that were like, yeah, someone that converts to Islam with a tattoo, he'll have to make tayammum perpetually.
Whoa.
Unless he removes the tattoo.
SubhanAllah.
Unless he removes the tattoo. And then a smaller body of scholars said, well, maybe not because of the, different circumstances and such. So Imam Abdul Ghani Ibn Yasin Al-Lubidi rahimahullah, he closes the issue by saying, no, if someone has it, someone is not required to make wudu. And he worked through the masail and the ilal and everything else, and he closed that masala. Right. These are the types of issues when you're looking down through history and it takes you the ability to understand these issues. Or another one is the cutting of the foliage of Mecca. And you're not supposed to cut Mecca's foliage or shrubbery unless you're making the pathway to Masjid al-Haram easier, whatever else. You're not supposed to fell its trees or whatever else. So then it's okay, well, what about its gravel? What if you're moving its gravel from one place to another in order to expand a property or build it or whatever else? That had been left because it was not a pressing issue. But when you get to the era of Abdul Ghani Al-Lubidi, it is a pressing issue, right? It's a pressing issue, right? The issue of saying Bismillah Wallahu Akbar over several cows at once while they're being slaughtered versus one at a time. Well, that was left because that issue had not happened yet. But with the rise of mass-produced meat, now this issue comes up.
Interesting.
So now that mas'ala gets closed by Abdul Ghani Al-Lubidi rahimahullah, that issue gets closed by him. Right. So all these types of things, and then you have to include within the third part is sometimes there's ambiguity in the statement of what a particular marja says in his kitab. So you've looked like there'll be an ambiguity that Muwaffaq Ibn Qudamah rahimahullah has in Al-Mughni. You're like, okay, well, let's see if he clarified this statement. Check the Kafi, nope. Check the Umdah, no. Commentary on the Umdah, no. Al-Mughni, he didn't even mention it here. All right, well then what do we do? Well, now you take it back to the ashab, the companions of the madhhab, because he must have been. So now it's like, okay, well, his mukhtasar on al-Hidayah. Let's look there. Okay, this ambiguity happens in Al-Mughni. What's Al-Mughni based on? So now you go back to all the mutaqaddimun elders' words and everything else, and now you have to do actually ijtihad on the statement made by that mujtahid to say, all right, as far as we can tell, it looks like he was referring to this. And so you'll get elders, the same thing with the muntaha and the iqna'. in the later ages where sometimes there'll be a statement that's made. Like for example, sometimes Imam Al-Hajjawi will have a statement in the Iqna' that seems to be in contradiction with the Zad al-Mustaqni. Right? Or there'll be something where, because when the Iqna' and the Muntaha are agreed together, that's the Mu'tamad. When they differ, that's the Muntaha. But sometimes there'll be a statement in the Iqna' that, if read a certain way, like the voweling, if you vocalize it a certain way, it's in agreement with the Muntaha. But if you vocalize it another way, it's not. So it's like, okay, well, how is this supposed to be read and vocalized? So then you go to all the commentary literature and you break all this stuff down, and you find out some of the times that, well, listen, this could be read either way. Okay, well then how did the students read it? Like, how did they how did they understand the kitab? Like, how can they understand this expression? So it's also breaking down what these Muradi understood. So that's also something that has to be taken into consideration. So when someone, as we've said before, we have to revisit this. When someone said, well, why don't they just go back to the book and sunnah? Well, precisely because we've been there.
Exactly.
That's why we got here. We've looked at all the ahadith. We've looked at all the ayat. We've looked at everything, and it led us down this massive road.
Yes. Hundreds of years of efforts.
And now we're here.
So
and now, because we're here, there's an ambiguity in Muwaffaq Ibn Qudamah. Why? Because Muwaffaq Ibn Qudamah is a Palestinian.
MashaAllah.
And the particular form of Arabic he might have used like a Palestinian word. Okay, well, now we got to go back to the Arabic dictionaries. Okay, what did this word mean in the context that it was said in? Now we go to his nephew, we go to his cousins. All right, what would this have meant in this context? And fortunately, the awesome thing about Shamsuddin Qudamah is he recognizes that, okay, sometimes we're using Palestinian dialect.
Wow.
When that happens, listen, he means this. This word means this, but it's in reference to he understands that there's a dialectical difference. And so when he's speaking to the rest of the Muslim world, he's like, listen, this word means this word in general. So he understood that and clarified the words of his uncle. So he's absolutely crucial. And so in Marja literature, he's just referred to as Ash-Sharih, the commentator. That's his title. Right? Shaykh Mashakhina, that's Hasan Al-Shati. When you see that in late literature, Shaykh Mashakhina, that's Hasan Al-Shati. Ar-Ruhaybani is Imam Mustafa Ruhaybani. It's like these elders are at that level where you just refer to them as a laqab. The Musannif, the author, that's Al-Karmi. Everybody knows who that's Al-Karmi. Then Ash-Shaykh, that's Muwaffaq Ibn Qudamah. Ash-Shaykh, that's it. Or Al-Muwaffaq, that's him.
Right.
Or Al-Majd, that's him. Right? And then Abu al-Abbas, that's Taqiyuddin Taymiyyah. Everybody knows who that is. Right? Or Bahr al-Ulum. Right? Okay. Sometimes Shaykh al-Islam. Right? But usually you'll have like Abu al-Abbas. He said this. It's like, that's Taqiyuddin Taymiyyah. Right? Or Ibn Qa'id has said this. Or Al-Najdi. Al-Najdi, that's Ibn Qa'id al-Najdi. Who died 1078 Hijri. Right? Okay, we know who that is. Because he's the latest commentator. He's the commentator on Imam Al-Buhuti's last statement in Fiqh, which is Umdah al-Talib. He wrote a commentary called Hidayat al-Raghib. So he is the authoritative commentator on that kitab, right? Which is extremely important. So when he's cited in literature, these alqab, these titles are used for these imams, where you have to learn these things, you have to know and understand their date. And in different kutub, it might mean different things. Like al-Qadi, if it's up until the 900s, it's al-Qadi Abu Ya'la. But after that, it's Alauddin al-Mardawi.
Okay.
Now you need to understand that. So I had someone send me something. They were trying to establish something in the school of Imam Ahmed, but they didn't understand that because a series of kutub were quoted, and then Taqiyuddin Taymiyyah was referenced to. And this miskeen individual, Allah forgive him and increase him in knowledge so that he's not astray like he is, and guide him from the destruction that he's on the path of. He thought that those 9 works were Taqiyuddin Taymiyyah.
Subhanallah.
No, those 9 works, the reason why they don't cite the author of those works is because you're supposed to know who the authors are of those works. The fact that you had that confusion is proof positive that you're not supposed to be reading Al-Insaf. That's the proof of that. The fact that you had that incident is evidence that you can't read the Insaf. Right? If just as much the case, someone like that, you take them to the first volume and say, okay, read the Muqaddimah. If you can't vocalize the Muqaddimah, okay, you can't read this book. You can't read it. Because the Muqaddimah is there for that purpose, that the people that can vocalize the Muqaddimah, the Muqaddimah of books like this are intentionally written in a complex fashion because it's a doorway to the rest of the text. So the Al-Insaf is written in just that fashion, right? So these scholars, when they're handing down these books and passing them down, there's hundreds of years of effort, as you mentioned, on these different masail, new issues that have come up in an area that have had to be dealt with. Some areas they had to leave because it wasn't a priority at that time. Then it later becomes a priority because it comes into vogue, which is another thing, is some rulings come in and out of force. Like there are some times where certain times in history in the Ummah where certain rulings aren't needed. So it's just not, it's just left open. But then it becomes important to where it's like, okay, now we have to talk about this. Like for example, Imam Ibn Qudamah rahimahullah, in Al-Umdah makes a reference to eggs and not selling your own eggs. He just made an ijtihad on a matter regarding not being able to sell your own eggs, whether it's an animal or whatever else, because they're not your eggs. And he just left it there and never touched it. And Baha'u'ddin al-Maqdisi left it and never touched it. Well, it now is important.
And that's remarkable.
It's now important. And this is why every single one of my teachers has always said this same statement. He said, the true mujtahid is not a product of his own time. The true mujtahid is not a product of his own time. Because the fact of when he's doing ijtihad is he's stepping outside of his time. He's outside of his time. He's outside of that era, in order to be able to transcend it, to give the ijtihad that's going to be there for that time and times after. Because he's going into the book and the sunnah, which is the kalam of Allah and the sunnah of his messenger, alayhi salatu wasalam, which is for all times and places. So he can't be a product of his time when he's giving his ruling. So when you understand all of that, you understand some of the rulings that come to pass. Sometimes they're rulings that were left open because something hadn't happened or it wasn't in force at the time. Then it comes back into force. Now we start talking about it again, or start making reference to it again.
And how about when a mas'ala is closed? Does that then become the final mu'tamad ruling?
Yes, that's the final statement, because because when it was open, there were 2 statements.
Right.
So when there were 2 statements, so you'll find in some older books, like this is a statement regarding this matter. So you'll find in older books regarding tattoos and someone entering Islam, it's like open. It's like some scholars have said this, some scholars have said that. And it's left. You're like, it's still open. But then you get to Abdul Ghani al-Lubadi rahimahullah, and he's like, okay, listen, this issue is actually, because there was no one else to answer it, it's now fallen to me because no one else has answered it before. Allah help me and forgive me, but I've now given this answer. Now the mas'ala is closed. Mas'ala is closed because he had a council meeting. When he was on Hajj, in his Hajj book, there's about 4 or 5 masail he closes because he's having council meetings on Hajj. He died on Hajj. He's buried in Jannat al-Ul-Aalah in Mecca. He's buried not far from Khadija and the rest of many. So they, radiallahu anhum ajma'in, he's buried with them. He was closing masail on Hajj. So his hashya is very, very important. And then he's also got quotes from people like Yusuf al-Barqawi, the big Azhari sheikh from the Palestinian territory, the big alim. And he's the sheikh to so many Hanbali sheikhs that are around today. He's the sheikh either to them or he's the sheikh of their sheikhs. He's extremely important Baraqawi. And he's the inheritor of the Qadumis and the Shatis,
Yeah.
which is another thing that's important. And Abdullah Sufyan al-Qudumi, rahimahullah, his laqab is just Sufyan. Everyone knows who that is.
Subhanallah.
Oh, the Sufyan. Oh, subhanallah. He said this. That's it. It must be, established. Because Imam Abdullah Sufyan al-Qudumi, he closed some masail. Like the issue you asked, that really good question about samawat being in some mutun of rising from ruku'. ربنا ولك الحمد ملء السماوات من الأرض من الشيء من شيء بعد, and in some ملء السماء من الأرض من الشيء من شيء بعد. He said, listen, the text that we found by examining is the ملء السماء is the more regularly used and the more time. So he closed the mess up.
Remarkable.
So yeah, that's a really good question. So I don't get very many good questions. Like usually it's like a lot of the recycling things, like how many times do you need to keep answering? No, these people are astray, right? But sometimes you'll get, alhamdulillah, good questions, right? And that's a good question. But some of the other slaves of Allah that send me questions outside of yourself will send me didn't we already establish before? Like if Sheikh Suleiman or Mustafa Shati aren't enough, I don't know what else can be done. Yeah. I don't know what else can be done. Yeah. They've established the foothold, that's pretty much it,
Yeah, I just keep quoting them to everyone.
Yeah.
I don't need any other source.
Yeah, it's just, look, just do this. So yes, when these masail get closed, they then get passed along because now they're closed. Now, it may be that an individual mufti or an individual person might not know that it's closed. And that's fine, but it's still closed. And it's for the other people that know to make sure to popularize that ruling, to make sure that it's known that this issue is closed. Yeah, so that's a common one. So you'll be doing buhuth on some mas'ala and then realize it's been closed here. Because Imam Muwaffaq Ibn Qudamah, rahimahullah, by setting down that curriculum, he also wound up closing a whole bunch of masail. He closed a whole bunch of masail to the point that later scholars after his time took Mukhtasar al-Khiraqi, put Al-Mughni with it. Then they took Al-Mughni and the commentary, put it with it, and put it all together in a set that sold called Al-Mughni with Sharh al-Kabir. So you're literally getting 5 books in one.
Wow.
And it's like 14 volumes. And in addition to that, they alphanumerically, the fatwa were also alphanumerically coded as well. So then you get to see which masail are open and which are closed. So it's really brilliant. And then the last 2 volumes in that set also go through the masail. And sometimes they'll have like a little zay if it's open, and then like a little scene if it's closed. So that's useful as well.